Welcome to the History Den YouTube channel. This is the 8th video in the Ancient Greek series. Before we get to the next video on the Persian Wars, it's important that we discuss the rise of the Persian Empire, and this will help set the context for the epic wars between Persia and Greece that we will be covering soon. Now, the Persians created an empire that was simply mind-boggling in ancient times. It was one of the largest land empires we saw in antiquity, only outdone by Alexander the Great and Rome, but it was there centuries before anybody had heard of the Romans. So let's take a look at what's going on in the Middle East before the Persians become what they ultimately became. If you take a look at this map, this is around 600 BC, and you'll notice on that map there's 4 major empires. You have the Kingdom of Media, which is in yellow. You have the Kingdom of Babylonia, which lies to the south, and at this point is probably the most powerful empire. You have the Kingdom of Lydia, which occupies the coast of modern-day Turkey, and that's where some of the Ionian Greek states are located. And of course there is Egypt and its dynasty right here. Now in terms of land, you can take a look at Greece and see just how small it is compared to the rest of these kingdoms. So these are massive kingdoms with a huge amount of people, much more than the Greeks have. Now, the Persians at this point do not even have an empire of their own. They are part of the Median Empire. And you can see the Persians right here. They're located just to the east of the Persian Gulf. And so it's the Medians who have control of all of the tribes on the Iranian Peninsula, including Persia. Now, the Medians and the Persians are very close culturally. You'd almost call them close cousins. In fact, the ancient Greeks had a hard time telling the difference between the two. And that is why you'll see Herodotus, if you decide to read him, or if you have read him, he'll consistently call the Persians the Medes, because they saw no difference between the two. He'll also refer to them as the barbarians, because the Greeks, especially the Spartans and the Athenians, viewed the Persians as mere barbarians. Of course, they were much more than that. This was an advanced civilization that deserved the name empire. So, as you can see, the Medians established the first kingdom, but it was the Persians who eventually take over. And that was done by one man. A single man took over the entire Median Empire and conquered them. And his name was Cyrus the Great. So we're going to talk about Cyrus right now and the rapid growth of the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC. Cyrus took over the Achaemenid dynasty in 550 BC. He became the king. That is why it is called the Achaemenid Empire. Now, about 10 years later, after he becomes king, he takes over and conquers the Medians. Now, Cyrus was quite gentle with Medians. He blends the two cultures, as I mentioned before, under one government. And so both Median and Persian nobles were appointed to the top positions. And this is probably why Herodotus is referring to the Persians as the Medes. So after that process is completed, he goes on a relentless push towards the west, a push that will eventually bring him dangerously close to the Greek mainland. He conquers Armenia, then Cappadocia, then Lydia, and eventually the grand prize of all, Babylonia, which happens in about 539 BC. And it is Babylonia that is Cyrus's crowning achievement and puts him on the path towards total domination of Asia Minor. So if you take a look at this map below, this constitutes Cyrus's entire empire that he conquered. And you can see it's an extraordinary distance. It stretched all the way from India to the Aegean Sea and up against Greece. So in that day, there was really nothing that had ever been seen like this. And that lasted right up until the time of Alexander. Now, a quick word about the Lydians. The Lydians go way back and were probably formed around the 7th century. And if you read the writings of Herodotus, this is the first empire that he talks about in his book. They were important because they were the empire that bordered the Greek city-states. And in fact, by the time of Cyrus, many of these Greek city-states had been taken over by the Lydians. Now, the king of Lydia was a guy named Croesus, and he unwisely decided to invade the Persians, perhaps to check the growing influence of the Persian Empire. But it completely backfired. And as I mentioned, the Persians swiftly destroyed the Lydian Empire and took over Lydia's Greek possessions. So by 539 BC, the mainland Greeks certainly had to be aware of the Persian Empire because they were on the Ionian coast. Cyrus died in 530 BC. His son Cambyses took over, and continued the expansion of the Persian Empire. He conquered Egypt in 522 BC. Now, Egypt was a very powerful empire in its own right. Cambyses also began to take over some territories in northern Greece near Thrace. And at this point, right before the Persian Wars, the Achaemenid Empire stretches from Egypt all the way to India, and to the north, it reaches the Danube River. Now, to the north of the Danube River is a race of people called the Scythians. They controlled a vast amount of territory that stretched all the way into Russia. The Scythians, though, were not united into an entire kingdom. They were a loose collection of tribal states. They did not even have an agricultural base. They got their food from raising or herding animals. Cambyses decided to invade this territory, but was unable to conquer the Scythians. The Scythians used hit-and-run tactics and refused to engage the main Persian army. Cambyses finally decided that he had had enough and wisely deduced this territory was simply not worth conquering, as they could not inflict a decisive defeat on the Scythians. So this brings us right up into the time of the Greco-Persian Wars. And if you take a look at that map, it's easy to see what the next natural invasion route was for the Persians: Greece. And furthermore, you can see just how small Greece is now compared to the entire Persian Empire at its fullest extent. Okay, so let's transition here for a little bit and talk about the Persian requirements to join the empire. The first thing you had to give was a symbol of earth and water to the great king, and that was a symbol of your absolute obedience to the king's will. So if you wanted to do business with the Persians, you had to do that first. Now, if you didn't do that, the Persians might simply go away, or they might decide to attack. Now, if you did give earth and water, you were required to do two things, and that was really it. You had to pay your taxes, though they weren't too high, and I think to the average person, this probably didn't make much of a difference to them. They had to pay taxes previously to some other noble, now it was just a new noble they had to pay their taxes to. So they probably saw little change at the lowest level. In other words, this was a change at the highest echelons, but the daily life of the common person was essentially unchanged. The second thing you had to do was provide troops if the great king needed those forces in a military campaign. So if you did just those two things, the Persians pretty much left you alone. They didn't really bother you. So they actually had a reputation for being very gentle rulers. And it was really Cyrus who set this precedent. Cyrus would go out of his way to placate his subjects. Cyrus even issued an edict to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. Thus, the Jews referred to Cyrus as anointed of the Lord. So you can see how well liked the Persians were by the people they conquered. Well liked until they ran into the Greeks. The Greeks looked at that symbol of earth and water as a form of slavery. But we will talk about that in the next video. Cyrus parceled out Persia into 20 provinces called satrapies. Each province had a governor that was called a satrap, and that stood for protector of the kingdom. The satraps divided their time between civil administration and the military. They wielded tremendous power with large garrisons and bodyguards. Now, to ensure the satraps did not become too powerful, the great king personally appointed the garrison's military commanders. Thus, each garrison commander reported directly to the great king. Eventually, the satraps formed the Persian nobility. These also were similar to the Greek tyrants, but once again, they ruled very gently over their subjects. The Persian army was one of the largest and most dangerous of antiquity. It was a very well-organized system and had a very organized command structure. Each unit was determined by factors of 10. So the smallest unit would be 10, the next largest would be 100, the next would be 1,000, and so on. The Persian army was a year-round standing army, complete with professional soldiers and numerous specialists. Most of these troops were stationed in city garrisons. During a large-scale conflict, a small percentage of the army remained in these garrisons, while the main body engaged the enemy. The Persian cavalry was always the strongest unit, but the infantry was countless in its numbers, but not nearly as well disciplined or as well trained as the Greek hoplite. The Persians always preferred to fight on open plains, where their numbers alone could be decisive. During periods of war, the great king could call a draft, and this would greatly increase the size of available troops of the Persian Empire. As time passed by, the Persians became extremely wealthy. With no real civil wars or strife within their own borders, their warriors lost much of their discipline. The later Persian armies were far more apt to break ranks during heated battle. To keep the army from deteriorating, mercenaries were hired to fill the ranks. This was especially the case after the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian king's personal bodyguard was a 10,000 strong crack unit called the Immortals. These were professional soldiers and usually of Median or Persian stock. The unit was always kept at 100% strength. Even in battles, replacements were kept very close at hand to replace the injured, and this maintained the division's operational strength. The Immortals wore colorful uniforms and were given the best equipment. When on the march, the Immortals had their own wagons and even their own personal servants. And of course, the best rations were always distributed to the Immortals. As a result, the Persian king believed these units to be unbeatable. That theory would be put to the test against the famed Greek hoplite. The Immortals were equipped with a bow and a short iron-headed spear. They also were provided with a short sword. The shield was made of wicker, and the breastplate was made of metal scales, which was covered by a cloth tunic. The Immortals did not wear metal helmets. Instead, they wore a soft cloth tiara. Though well equipped, the mortals did not have the same level of protection as the Greek hoplite, as vital areas of the body were only covered by cloth. The Persians had no fleet or skills on the sea as their army had evolved inland. Their fleet was built primarily from the client states. That is, the Egyptians and Phoenicians were excellent seamen and provided the majority of ships to the Persian navy. Ironically, the Persians also relied on ships and crews provided to them by the Ionian Greeks, whom they had subjugated in Asia Minor. At its height, the Persian navy reached around 1,200 ships, though this number has been debated by historians. Okay, that is going to wrap it up for this video. In the next video, we finally reach the Greco-Persian Wars, the defining moment in Greek history.